Let's put it into a context. Context is always more useful. Let's say that there's a teachers conference and you want to influence some of the teachers to change teaching styles, and they talked about their values, about some kids that they helped out in some desperate situation. You know, it's interesting you should say that, because you know, there's so many different ways I found that you can reach kids, and some of them work okay, some of them work really well. For example, so we spend all this time to build up your storytelling skills in order to be able to do something with it, right? You have one little model already, the nested loops with a transformational story in the middle. That's one nice little model for stories that influence. I'd like to give you another one that's a little bit more linear, but actually fits a lot of natural conversations more fully. So these are basically, we'll call it the influence formula, and it's very straightforward. It actually includes the kind of stories you've already been telling. What I'd like to do is I'd like to build this up with you guys in bit by bit, so that you focus on each stage at a time, and then just let the natural conversation evolve. Start by finding a new partner, someone you haven't actually worked with today yet. And all you're going to do is spend about a minute or so just socially vibing, just chit-chatting about anything. No, the course, oh, wine, oh, look, weather, oh, cars, whatever. Just chit-chatting, normally social vibing. They say some, you say some, right? If in that time you can introduce a little story, like your who am I story, or your value story, so much the better, right? You move from chit-chat into a story. And it's very simple, because every chit-chat will end up having to actually ask you a question, or you make a comment, go, oh yeah, you know what? I had something like that happen, and off you go into your little who am I story. Does it make sense to everyone? Find a new partner, stay with them, because then we're going to add some layers on top of that as you go along. Easy? Off you go. So first good question. Do you notice how it's relatively simple to transition from socially vibing type stuff into a who I am type story? That's a very acceptable social thing to do, right? And you probably also notice that what happens is there's a trade-off. You tell one of yours and they tell one of theirs. Would that be fair to say? So it's a very natural transition. So we're going to take that transition and just imagine that you were in the same point when we broke off. So just pick up the theme again, back to this little social chit-chat. Then tell your second story, which will be your value story, or either your value story or why am I here story. Either one will be fine, right? So you've basically told two personal stories to get a real sense of who you are. So far, so easy, right? So we're really in the same category. We're talking about personal stories that introduce yourself to someone else, and they fit the social context. What we want to do at that point is we want to transition from personal stories that are about understanding who you are and being able to predict you and so on, into stories that will allow you to start influencing the others. There'll be stories about them in some way or other, right? And we have two vehicles that you can play with for this. The first one is the story we talked about yesterday, the mind reading. Do you recall that one? I know you're experiencing this and that, and I have a story about that sort of thing. The other one is a much simpler version of it, which is essentially you just pre-frame it, right? You tell your value story, or they tell their value story, and then you might say something along the lines of, it's interesting you say that. It just, let's put it into a context. Context is always more useful. Let's say that there's a teachers conference and you want to influence some of the teachers to change teaching styles, and they talked about their values, about some kids that they helped out in some desperate situation. It's interesting you should say that, because there's so many different ways I found that you can reach kids, and some of them work okay, some of them work really well. For example, and now you've opened the door to allow your influence stories to step in. Does that make sense to you guys? It's just a very simple pre-frame preamble, or you can go for the whole mind read, like you're probably feeling this, this, and this. I was as frustrated when I experienced these things with my students. And that opens the door wide for an open loop for the next story to occur, and we'll talk about that afterwards. Make sense? Do you understand the exercise? So you'll go back to the same partner. You'll pick the conversation up where you left off, so you both introduce each other with stories. So now you're going to basically vibe a little bit more, and then go straight into your either your value story or your why am I here story. They'll do a similar thing about give them a sense of your motivation, a sense of where your boundaries lie, and segue from that story into a pre-frame, and then just kind of pause it there, or your mind reading story, which again leaves an open loop to do something else. At that point, of course, you'll just backtrack back to social vibing, and they'll do the same thing for their own. It's a little bit of a artificial situation after that point, because the other person has to have a go too. But hopefully you'll see that's pretty much the same pattern being run. Do you understand what I mean by that? Easy? So head back to your partners. Okay, off you go. How'd that go? Interesting? Yeah? Who found it relatively natural to vibe a bit, tell a personal story, vibe a bit, tell a more personal story in terms of your values and so on, vibe a bit more, and tell a kind of transitional story like a mind-reading thing, or to just set a simple pre-frame that would lead into you being able to tell another story. Relatively easy? Of course, you realize you can do any of these things here with open or closed loops. The more you open the loops, the more curiosity you build. If you need to create more certainty, you'll close those loops. It just depends on how this conversation goes. Sometimes people force an open loop by presenting their story before you're done. My heuristic, my rule of thumb is if I get interrupted, I tend not to go back to the story unless I really need to, unless they actually ask for it, right?